So without further ado, Amanda, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you all see my slideshow all right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. My presentation is titled "An Elephant in Dublin: Animals and Knowledge in the Late 17th Century." As for content warnings, I will be discussing the accidental death of an elephant in captivity and his subsequent dissection. I will not, however, go into graphic detail about the dissection, but I will briefly show artwork that depicts some of his body parts near the end of the presentation. So, in June 1681, an elephant died in a fire while on display in Dublin, after which his remains were dissected by Irish surgeon and anatomist Alan Mullen. Reconstructing this elephant's life and death reveals a web of connections centered around him. His story illuminates the multiple meanings that other than human animals like him could have in early modern Europe, as well as their presence in a variety of places in early modern life. In both life and death, as people considered this elephant a commodity to be bought, sold, and displayed, he was a wonder and a curiosity, inspiring fascination in those who saw him. He was also a subject of study who could provide highly sought after natural knowledge. In all of these roles, the elephant was an animal with whom people interacted, whether as a living creature or in the form of preserved remains. In this presentation, I will focus in detail on the Dublin elephant's time in the British Isles and Ireland, as well as the events following his death. While he was certainly one of many elephants and other exotic animals who came to Europe during this period, he was also an individual elephant with his own unique story. I hope that treating his story individually will provide us more room to recognize that he too was a participant, although unwilling and exploited in these events, and I hope it also goes some way toward understanding the lives of other than human animals in the early modern world more broadly. The elephant who died in Dublin was likely the same elephant who had arrived in London in 1675. Reports of the Dublin elephant's death, pictured here on the slide, as well as advertisements from Mullen's anatomical account, connected him with the elephant who had recently been on show in London. So this elephant landed at Whitefriars in August 1675. He had been sent to or acquired by merchant, politician, and Royal Society fellow Lord George Berkeley, whose simultaneous involvement in several trading companies and the scientific institution exemplifies the integral links between natural knowledge and empire in Restoration England. The elephant came from the East Indies. In South and Southeast Asia, rulers captured Asian elephants for use in warfare, ceremonies, and as pack animals. In the early modern period, there was therefore a significant trade in living elephants in response to this demand. This particular elephant possibly came from Banten, a Muslim port polity in northwest Java. The English East India Company, which Berkeley was affiliated with, had established a factory in Banten in the early 17th century and continued to be involved in trade there until the Dutch East India Company gained control of the area in 1684. After arriving in London, the elephant was reportedly kept for a while in St. John's Court near Clerkenwell Green. Lord Berkeley had a residence in London on St. John's Lane, so it is possible that he was keeping the elephant on or near his property. After this, the elephant was sold for the quite hefty sum back then of £2,000. I don't at this point know who purchased the elephant, but whoever did decided to display him to the public for a fee. He was moved to the White Horse Inn on Fleet Street, where, as advertised in the City Mercury newspaper, he could be seen, quote, at any time of the day. In the 16th and 17th centuries, exotic animals were often used as diplomatic gifts and therefore ended up in court and princely menageries. Menageries became increasingly popular in many areas of Europe and were used by rulers and other affluent individuals to display their power and wealth. Before the Dublin elephant, for example, the last elephant to have been in England was given to King James I by Philip II of Spain. The Dublin elephant story fits into this larger history of exotic animals. However, it is notable that people considered him valuable mainly as a commodity to be bought, sold, and displayed to the public for money rather than as a diplomatic gift. This seems to have been increasingly true of animals in the late 17th century and 18th century Britain. Shortly after the Dublin elephant's death, for example, another elephant as well as a rhinoceros came to London and were similarly displayed. So Londoners could see the elephant in print as well as in person. Two publications about him were printed after his arrival in the city. Both included a woodcut image of the elephant, a summary of the characteristics of elephants as a species, and a brief physical description of the elephant who had come to London. Both emphasized the wondrous nature of elephants and their rarity in England, basing much of their material on ideas about elephants deriving from ancient Greek and Roman writers. These pamphlets also revealed that elephants had a recognized presence in London in commodified form, as both mentioned the animal's role in producing ivory that was used to make combs. It appears that the elephant remained in London until 1679. After this, he may have traveled to Glasgow in early 1681, when the Scottish preacher Robert Law recorded the arrival of an 11-year-old elephant who had been sold for £2,000. Finally, the elephant arrived in Dublin sometime before June 1681. In Dublin, as in London, he was exhibited to the public for a fee. However, unfortunately, in June, the elephant's booth caught fire, leading to the deaths of the elephant and one person. So according to London newspaper reports of the elephant's death, the person who died was a young boy who rode on the elephant, but no more information is provided about him. After the elephant passed away, Irish medical practitioner Alan Mullen gained permission to perform a dissection on his remains. At that time, Mullen was studying medicine at Trinity College, Dublin. The account of this dissection was printed in London in 1682. There is evidence that English natural philosopher, administrator in Ireland, and Royal Society fellow William Petty had a hand in arranging the dissection. In a letter from July 1681, Petty mentioned that he had, quote, taken care that the elephant, which was so unfortunately burnt here in Dublin, might be dissected, and the report of it be sent to the Royal Society, unquote. So why was there such an interest in dissecting an elephant? Well, most basically, exotic animals were both popular and intellectual interest in this time period. Elephants were considered especially wondrous and had a host of ideas about their intelligence associated with them that dated back to antiquity. The Royal Society's interest also was part of its broader interest in natural history. Dissection and natural history were allied pursuits, and the Society was therefore curious about animal anatomy, especially the anatomy of exotic animals such as elephants. So Mullen himself provided some indication of his own hopes for the dissection, which combined these different facets of fascination with elephants. He stated that he thought the dissection had the potential to elucidate the elephant's wondrous nature. For instance, quote, why he comes to be more capable of doing things which seem to require ratiocination than any other brutes that we know. He also thought that the dissection could clarify the functions of the elephant's body parts and organs. So unsurprisingly then, given who he was, Mullen exhibited a marked interest in the elephant's anatomy, but he also combined this with an interest in the elephant as a living creature. For example, Mullen expressed interest in how the elephant had behaved while he had been alive. In this passage, Mullen wrote that the elephant's ears were, quote, always observed to hang, except at such times as the elephant was vexed, and then they were gathered like a purse and stood forward, at which time he always contracted his trunk, and so made ready to shoot it out and to punch either man or beast that angered him, unquote. The emphasis on the elephant's emotions or passions in this description suggests that he had some amount of subjecthood in Mullen's view. He possessed intentionality, motivation, and an experience that he expressed through his actions, which Mullen interpreted correctly or incorrectly in human-like terms. It's also noteworthy that Mullen tended to refer to the animal in the singular he throughout his account, perhaps to emphasize
it's working.
His methodological choice to be interested in the particularity of the dissection experience and his dissection subject. This focus on the particularity of the elephant as an anatomical subject meant that the elephants perhaps had more of a recognized identity in Mullen's account than he otherwise might have been granted in a situation like this. So Mullen's dissection of the elephants was not the end of the story. The elephant's remains were transformed into a number of objects, which were desirable to a wide range of individuals. Some of the elephant's remains were preserved by Mullen. William Petty mentioned in a letter that the elephant's owner hoped to make money by displaying them. There seems to be have been some disagreement as to the proper fate of the elephant's remains, as Petty lamented that he had been unable to purchase them for the Royal Society's repository of natural objects. This discussion underscores the reality of the early modern market for nature and the tensions that it could spark. Although the Royal Society was ultimately unable to acquire the elephant's remains for its repository, engravings of them were made and published along with Mullen's account of the dissection. In early modern Europe, artwork such as this was a frequent way to view and collect animals sort of virtually. Therefore, it represents one method by which people developed ideas about animals whom they had not encountered in person. These images would, of course, give a person a very particular and incomplete view of elephants when focused on their anatomy and constituent body parts. To conclude, the elephant's journey took him to various locations, from the East Indies to London, perhaps to Glasgow, and finally to Dublin. A web of connections centered on this well-traveled elephant, connections which illuminate several human networks of trade, knowledge, and correspondence. Numerous people were linked to the elephant and to one another through their involvement in his story, and their interactions with the elephant occurred in a variety of ways. Erica Fudge has called the early modern English farm a shared space, in which both human and other than human actors interacted and engaged with one another. There were many such shared spaces in early modern Europe. Scholars have, for instance, explored the presence of animals in early modern courts and cities. I would also argue that we should broaden our concept of space to consider early modern scientific pursuits such as anatomy as shared human-animal spaces. Animals were frequent and important anatomical and experimental subjects. They were relied on when humans were unavailable, inconvenient, or considered unethical to use. The Dublin elephant story therefore illuminates some of these early modern shared spaces of animal-human interactions. In this presentation, I've hoped to illustrate the very real presence of other than human animals in many areas of early modern life, as well as how studying the lives of animals like this elephant allows us to track human connections both with each other and with animals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm Victoria, and as I was introduced, and I'm looking at how to put animals into local politics, and hopefully it'll become clear during the presentation what I mean by that. So my research project, my MA, is going to be on looking at manifesto commitments in UK parliamentary elections since 1979. But when I was working in political campaigning, I'm very interested in what goes into manifestos and speeches and election campaign material and what's left out, like what the issues are. And very often it's kind of not what the candidate is interested in, but it's about what they think might be a voter turn off or a turn on. So I want my research to have a practical application, and I want to kind of work with elected representatives, encouraging them not to be afraid to put animal welfare or animal protection measures and to speak about them as electorally significant. And kind of think the converse of that, encouraging campaigners and activists not to be afraid of engaging in political lobbying, if you like, or putting animals into politics is also really important. Move on to the next slide. I can say why politics. It's not necessarily a place that we may think that we encounter other animals. However, I would argue that despite kind of Aristotle's observation that only a beast or a god could live outside the polis, arguably our political community in modern politics, like the state and all its apparatus and everything, is made possible because of the presence of other animals. And the myriad of ways that we've exploited and used them has entailed keeping them inside the polis and turning their presence into an unseen driver. So if we accept that other animals are ethically significant members of our political community, then it's perhaps kind of at the apex of that political community, sort of the legislative process, and that we could focus our efforts on laying down the milestones that go towards reforming our relationships with other animals. And I think that that's the debt that we owe them. So, and that was certainly the conclusion of Lord Houghton, who was a Labour MP and a campaigner for animal welfare reform. And to Parliament we must go was his rallying cry when he was speaking to animal welfare organisations and encouraging them to get involved in the political process. So in 1978, he helped to establish the General Election Coordinating Committee for Animal Protection, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it can be to GCAP. And we can see there one of the campaign sort of brochures that they produced here. And using the slogan, putting animals into politics, their aim was to make animal protection a goal of government public policy. Whereas before it was kind of seen as a matter of individual conscience at MPs, and they could bring forward private members' bills. It wasn't considered like the serious business of government. And as a result of GCAP's campaign, for the first time ever in 1979, all three major parties carried commitments to animal protection in their manifesto. So the success of the GCAP was persuading political parties that animal welfare was an important or salient issue electorally. And hopefully in this presentation, I can attempt to show you how the desire of political parties and candidates to be elected and electable can be harnessed to benefit other animals. So we may ask why local politics. Well, first because local politics is sort of a special area of interest of mine, but also because as the Local Government Welfare Group, who are part of the Local Government Association, highlighted, that legislation may have good intentions, but it is enforcement which really makes a difference to animal welfare standards in reality. So the LGA is kind of a membership body of local councils. So out of the 333 councils in various forms in England, 331 belong to it. It's kind of what the BMA is to doctors. National legislation and lobbying for it is critical, but it's at a local level that it's often enforced. And on the next slide, we can see some of the areas in which the local authority takes responsibility, which is vastly different things. So it's looking at the health and welfare of farm animals at markets, sort of livestock markets, and welfare during transport, licensing, animal performances, down to pest control, and that can vary a lot between councils. And it'll also vary between different jurisdictions. So there are different levels of councils in this, as we'll see on another slide in a minute, as to who enforces that. And that is generally done by trading standards and environmental health, although councils do have statutory powers to hire animal welfare inspectors themselves. Less than 50% of councils actually do that. Move on to the next slide. So another reason that local politics is a good space is because it offers a political space to make gains for other animals. So voters often vote for different parties at national and local elections. And this has been estimated being that's just 13 to 30% of the electorate. And there are different reasons I put forward for why this might be. Some people say it's because they vote with their heart, because there's no pressure to kind of choose a government, and others have suggested it's to do with getting policy outcomes. In fact, Lindstrom in 2019 found that voters defected strategically to signal the salience of an otherwise overlooked issue to their preferred party. So why does this matter to us? It's because there's a pool of votes out there that we can persuade local candidates and parties for the taking. So you've got the switchers, possibly people who don't vote but are registered to vote, who may vote if there's something kind of out there that they see as attractive, and then what's called the squeeze vote. So that's when mainstream parties might target niche parties by taking on areas of policy that they were interested in. Another reason is that animal welfare is an issue that cuts across party lines. So a recent YouGov poll was asking about trophy hunting and fur and animal protection. You can see that the blue is the Conservative Party and the red is Labour. That actually they're quite close. And even when it came to, say, increasing the current level of animal protection, although 56 doesn't seem like a high amount, it is over half. And that increased to, I think it was 89% when it was also when the question maintain was added in. So animal welfare may not be the loudest issue on the political agenda, but perception isn't necessarily an indicator of electoral support or vote choice. And then another reason why local politics is a good example, is a good opportunity, is because there's great opportunity to build relationships. So as I said before, there are 333 councils in England and around 20,000 councillors. And there is one parliament and 650 MPs. So you can build closer relationships down to like ward level relationships. So a thing to consider here as well, which came out this year, is the all-party parliamentary group for animal welfare did a report on local authority enforcement. And they found that it was a lack of consistency, and this means that there are gaps where people aren't pushing their local councils and their local representatives to do their job and to fulfill like their animal welfare commitments. So the co-chair said that there was a postcode lottery in terms of animal welfare, and found that less than 50% of councils in England had a dedicated welfare officer. And they reckon the two things on the recommendations that they made, which was to have a statutory requirement for them to have a dedicated animal welfare officer, and also to establish regional forums where animal welfare protection could be discussed. So one of the questions that we might ask is, why should parties or candidates care about animal welfare? Why should they listen? And in short, it's because they want you to vote for them. Like politicians of all levels, from town council to parliament, are vote maximisers, and they want to be voted for. And the cross-party appeal of animal welfare means it can be presented as a vote maximising opportunity. So in short, if people who want to be elected think an issue is important to them, they'll pay attention to it. And the underlying thinking on this is termed the issue salience model of voting behaviour. So when people are writing campaign material, we don't sit around with candidates going, well, in 1950 there was this model of thing. Well, it's like, well, people in that road mentioned bins, so we're going to put bins on the leaflet. But what that means is we understood that what matters to voters matters to the party, and that the colour of the rosette isn't enough. So you don't need to study political science to get things done, but it can be helpful to understand kind of paths of thought regarding voter choice and electoral behaviour. So what is the issue salience model? Well, I have a highly technical diagram on the next page. I'm just trying to think of a way to kind of summarise it. So I don't know if you can see my pointer, but here we have voters who are kind of looking at these issues here, and the issues are running around here in the political agenda. And here on, so we have the political parties. I mean, those are the only colours I had, so I apologise for any parties that are not represented in colour there. They have nets there, and they're kind of trying to capture these issues and be they're like associated with them and have issue ownership to make their voters want to vote for them on those issues. And then Spoon suggests that there are issue entrepreneurs, which are often niche parties, but can also be upsells and public opinion, who kind of introduce new issues that then the parties try and capture. So as advocates and activists for other animals, we can use what the issue salience model tells us about party and voter behaviour and the issue entrepreneurs, reorientating local policy commitments towards animal protection and shaping political outputs in our communities. And by promoting animal welfare measures, local candidates and parties can signal their ownership of it as an issue and create a link in voters' minds between their party and animal protection and position themselves as their party of choice. So how do we become issue entrepreneurs and get animal protection onto the agenda? Well, I would say it's to campaign or lobby, some people don't like that word, or to advocate. And around the time of GCAP setting up this thing, one of the MPs in a debate in Parliament, Jay Rook, commented, the animal welfare societies as a whole have realised in the last 18 months or so that they must begin to use the political process as ruthlessly as does any other lobby operating in a democracy. And I think that's really important. Like, lots of interest groups are not afraid of putting their kind of needs and their demands through to politicians and asking for things. And we should be doing that too. And I should note that this wasn't a compliment. Jay Rook was pro-hunting. It was not a compliment, but he was recognising that it was an effective measure of doing that. So these are some of the things that I, in my research, and my experience, of things that we should think about when we are approaching local candidates, local parties. One is to think about what change that you want to see. The other is to kind of understand who can make that happen. So to understand the local authority, the setup and the roles and powers. So if you are in a two-tier council, then you've got like a county council and a district council, and there's no point going to the county council about something if it's something that's kind of in the jurisdiction of that council. Also just understand what parties, who's in charge. I would say that it's good to create fact sheets and draft motions, and a lot of organisations actually produce those and will help you with it. If you think of candidates as kind of little birds that need food dropping in their mouths, just give them as much information as you can to like persuade them. The other one is to demonstrate that there's voter or public or stakeholder support, and that's really important. And that could be done by just, if you are approaching a ward councillor because you want, now a ward is like an electoral area, to put something on their campaign material, showing them, a petition with lots of names on of residents, stuff like that, and also having stakeholder support from organisations in the community. And then the other one is to network or befriend. So if there's vegan fairs, invite councillors along, work with other activist groups, including non-animal protection groups. And by that I mean ones who do not necessarily have animal welfare as their goal, but perhaps environmental goals or community-based goals where you can work together to incorporate that. And then in the yellow here, I would say this is what you should be asking for, which is like party commitments, a local manifesto time, so get them to put pledges to do the things that you want into their manifesto so they're held to account. And the same with individual candidate pledges on election material. So most places produce what's called an election address at election time, and that has on it, the templates for most of the parties have on it little ticks where people put down pledges, so they can on that. And then motions, which is how stuff gets passed in council chambers. So they would introduce a motion and then that's voted in by the council. And I think one really good way of seeing like what can be done is to see what has been done. And these are just some of the areas in which people have had successes in advocating for animals. And I won't speak about all of them, but I'm not sure how much time, how the time's going, but I will just mention a few. So one of the fur-free markets with respect for animals is a really good one for people to approach their local council about. Respect for Animals have produced a model motion for councils, and they've got tips on how to get, how to approach the issue. And crucially, if councils sign up to their fur-free market, which is banning the sale of fur in markets, because a lot of the time people don't realize they're buying fur, they think it's imitation fur, but it isn't. What they offer is they offer a testing service free of charge to any council that signs up with them. So that can be a really good incentive for councils, and they have a database of local authorities that have signed up to it. So that can be inspirational, also a database of shame for those that haven't. And then another one is the Animal Welfare Charter. So quite a few councils have produced animal welfare charters that then are used when making like decisions about things and about supply chains. So they make certain commitments in there. So like some of the councils that have like the Forest of Dean and Lewisham, Lambeth and Tendring, which I think is in Essex, it's Tendring District Council. And in there, they've actually committed to any council suppliers, including suppliers to schools, would need to use free-range eggs. So, you know, you can actually get some welfare standards put in there that they'll then use, which also then makes their suppliers think about it and kind of, you know, you can have gains that way. And then the other thing is green spaces. So it may not necessarily be something that we think of when we think of animals. But if you, for example, Plymouth City Council manages 950 hectares, that's how you pronounce it, of green space, including 12 nature reserves, and created 120 wildflower meadows for bees and other pollinators, kind of like bee corridors, so allowing them to thrive. And then councils like Southampton and Derby have created bee bus stops, where they put like a living garden on top of bus stops to encourage bees and pollinators, but also other wildlife that maybe feeds off the insects that are on it and stuff. So, you know, there's ways of kind of respecting other animals in the city that we could encourage councils to think about. And the other one I'll just mention is the Motion for the Ocean, and that's one of the people who wrote that, who's Dr. Pam Buchan, was a Plymouth City councillor, and actually she graduated from Exeter University. She did a PhD here. So they're led by LGA Coastal, which is the local government association's coastal kind of organisation, and they're encouraging councils to sign a coastal recovery declaration, which is helping to like keep clean oceans, which will also help all the fish and the crabs and the shell creatures. I can't think of the word that kind of live in and around the sea. So these are kind of really important ways that people have made gains in advocating for animals in to local authorities. And then on the slide there, I've just put 3 kind of recommendations that were in the all-party parliamentary report that I think you could ask councils to commit to. So that's to hire dedicated animal inspectors, to allow their staff who may not be animal inspectors, so any staff dealing with it from trading standards or environmental health, to have specific training, and then also to commit to setting up regional forums. And I think that one of the kind of good things about the report is that it was made in conjunction with the local government association animal welfare group. So it's their own kind of body that's recommending it. I think it's quite a useful tool to go in and say, look, well, no, actually say you're not doing enough, but you could be like, look, this report has recommended this. You could show, good practice by implementing some measures. So hopefully I've demonstrated that there can be and there needs to be a co-location of responsibility between kind of promoting the interests of other animals at a local and a national level, and that can make real meaningful and practical implementation of animal protection legislation possible. And I just kind of wanted to finish on this, and that's the rabbit whose house I live in. He's called Snitter. I just wanted to show how beautiful he was. But I just wanted to say that I understand, like when doing this, that one of the kind of objections maybe, or two really, one is that people aren't comfortable with party politics. Kind of working with a party locally who's maybe doing something nationally and they don't like, and the other is the debate that's been forever in the animal protection movement around welfareism and abolitionism. And for me, what I've done is learn to sit with my discomfort, and that's what I would recommend, is that sometimes in order to kind of reach those milestones, make those gains, we need to compromise. And you know, I consider myself an abolitionist, but I think that the path that we take to get there doesn't need to be kind of a muddy swamp of thorns. It can have, like, you know, gains that kind of show the way. And I think kind of Clive Holland, he was talking in the aftermath of the GCAP success in getting political parties to look at it, and they were trying to pass through some legislation on animal experimentation. And he said, and I think it's worth just reading out, we do animals a disservice when we place our sacred principles regarding rights above achieving some progress and alleviating their suffering. As Lord Houghton has said in discussing this position, which entails all the problems and dilemmas that have faced other reformers throughout history, those who refuse to erect the milestones are not on the march. And to me, that speaks about, like, what I think that I must do, which is to kind of sit with compromise and sit with my own discomfort. And that's what I would urge people to do. Okay, thank you.
So hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here in this conversation. I'll be presenting on Cree. Sorry, I'm dealing with a little bit of a cold, so bear with me in my voice. Hopefully it makes it through to the end. I'll be presenting on Cree perspectives of Atik, which is the Cree name for what Euro-Westerners often translate as caribou. One content warning: I will mention the hunting, trapping, eating, and processing of other than human animals through the presentation, though I won't be going into any detail. So my multi-species ethnographic fieldwork on intercultural caribou conservation took place in 2019 around Lac La Ronge, which is a large boreal lake in what is now known as Saskatchewan, Canada. This region is the traditional and present-day home of woodland Cree and Métis peoples, and is located within ranges of Atik and boreal caribou. Following Sandy Suchit-Pearson and her colleagues in Baaa country, Australia, I've included Lac La Ronge as a co-author of this presentation to acknowledge the cognitive contributions of the more than human entities in and around this place. I want to tell you a story about Atik. This story does not fit easily into Euro-Western words, nor does it fit easily into the worldviews behind them. The linear unit-based approach fails to encompass the multiple dimensions of who Atik is to Cree peoples. As anthropologist Mario Blazer described in his 2018 article, Doing and Undoing Caribou Atiku, Indigenous and non-Indigenous perceptions of this animal are ontologically different beings, and these differences have significant ramifications in terms of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples work together toward their mutual conservation. Atik is a knot of sorts, a relational entanglement of more than human and more than physical actors, concepts, systems, and narratives. Following Donna Haraway, I use the concept of entanglement to become with more than human, more than physical Cree relational ontologies, which hold Atik not as an individual being, but as a relational focal point. The fundamental units of relational ontologies, such as those of the Cree, are relationships. And in this story, Atik are the central knot, the nexus. I'll start with the strands that form this Atik entanglement. In this agential cut that I make as a co-producer of this knowledge, I bring together an entanglement of more than human actors and groups of actors who have each crossed my path. Together, these shape how I perceive and categorize Atik across Canada. These actors include, but are not limited to, the multiple beings, concepts, and systems listed here, including myself, an interdisciplinary non-Atik, non-Cree settler researcher, who will attempt to bring together some of these voices. The list is lengthy and is still incomplete. Atik are at the center of many relationships. There is no way to detangle them from wolves, for example, nor from muskegs or bogs. And it is especially impossible to detangle Atik from the humans who concern themselves with them, those who still make their living in the boreal forest outside of human settlements, and those who live in cities far away but write documents that shape Atik and caribou futures. The anthropological and gray literature in my review focuses on the knowledge that Cree peoples across Canada hold about what I'm calling the Atik entanglement. And I narrow this focus to that of the non-migratory Atik, who exists in boreal forests, loosely translated to the boreal caribou ecotype of Rangifer tarandus. The anthropological literature spans between the present day and 50 years ago, and the gray literature includes traditional knowledge reports initiated by provincial and federal governments across Canada, written in the last 2 decades in response to the designation of boreal caribou as a threatened population in 2003. I also draw on my fieldwork with Cree Lac La Ronge community members. Atik bodies are entangled within webs of sustenance, with the bodies of those they eat, such as lichen, and the bodies of those who eat them, primarily wolves, bears, and humans. Cree values around balance play important roles across the literature, past and present, in the ways that Cree hunters and trappers engage both the Atik that are their food and the other predators who eat them too, and guide hunting practices and limits. Cree individuals in Western Canada are especially concerned with the impact of growing wolf populations on Atik. In traditional knowledge reports created by Environment Canada in 2011, many communities identified wolves as their primary threat. Some communities link the increase in wolves to the recent decline in trappers. Cree trappers view themselves as parts of their ecosystem, acting within it since time immemorial. However, there has been a dramatic decrease in trappers across Canada over the last several decades, as Indigenous peoples have been forced into settler lifestyles and economies as the cost of trapping increases and as interest in both fur globally and the trapping lifestyle locally have decreased. The sudden decrease in trappers, they argue, has caused an imbalance in the ecosystem. Some of the Cree values in literature that underlie current relationships with Atik, such as valuing balance in ecosystems, coincide well with Euro-Western conservation values. However, others, such as those that build on the ontological concept of kinship with all beings, differ in significant ways. Cree stories of a distant past in which animals had speech and were like human beings in many ways, stories of a caribou man, a human who through becoming more like Atik grows antlers and fur, and dreams in which humans and animals transform into each other, all work to reinforce the understanding of human kinship with Atik. These stories are viewed literally by many Cree individuals. Because of this, kinship relations with other than human animals are foundational within Cree ontologies, and other than human animals are viewed as agential persons, intelligent and capable of communication. Indeed, anthropologist Colin Scott found that root metaphors in Cree hunting terminology, quote, serve both to humanize animals and to animalize humans, such that humans are construed as only one of many species of persons in the world, whose interactions are mutual and reciprocal rather than hierarchical, end quote. Within this ontological framework, other than human animals actively and intentionally participate in hunting practices. Indications of their presence are interpreted by the hunters as signs showing either their willingness or unwillingness to be hunted and eventually killed. Because of this view of intentionality, relationships that Cree hunters maintain with game species can be friendly, familial, and even intimate. Ontological perspectives of Atik and as other than human persons change the way that Cree people conduct research as well as hunt. In contrast to many Euro-Western trained scientists, natural scientists who seek knowledge about caribou, Cree peoples work to respectfully learn what Atik want. Respect is a complex value that guides these relationships with Atik in multiple ways. It can be used as an umbrella term as it encompasses multiple other values, such as reciprocity, balance, and care, that pertain to Cree relationships with other than human animals. Many of the values linked with respect are also linked with the stewardship of the species. Reciprocity is one of the ways that Cree peoples practice respectful relationships with Atik. Reciprocal acts are pervasive in the culture and can be most easily seen in the exchange of gifts. Cree people offer gifts such as tobacco or beautiful art pieces, like the one moccasin seen here, to more than human and more than physical entities, and they receive gifts of food, medicine, and all things needed to live. Respectful practices of both hunting and of tending to animals killed in a hunt are other ways that Cree people express reciprocity. But these reciprocal relationships are not simply transactional. Colin Scott finds that the Cree understanding of reciprocity is built on the balance of life and death connecting all creatures, and on the mutual conversion of spirit and materiality as a cycle to be nurtured through socially and ecologically responsible actions. Here, the different understandings of death and life, spirit and materiality matter. For Cree peoples, successful hunting is perceived as a gift from the Atik themselves, and or from specific non-physical entities that the hunters communicate with. These non-physical entities, translated by anthropologists as spirits or species bosses, have an influence over species behavior and human access to them. Atik bosses, for example, can influence Atik migration and tell hunters of their locations. Hunters communicate with the bosses through dreams and forms of divination, and these communications have been as much a part of the hunting process as the act of hunting itself, necessitating hunters in both spaces to attune themselves to other beings, the Atik in one space and the boss in the other. These practices persist for many Cree hunters in the present day. While Canadian governments, as well as many Indigenous nations and communities, have worked to limit or ban the hunting of caribou as a part of conservation measures, the practice of respectful hunting following traditional guidelines is how many Cree peoples seek to maintain Atik populations through maintaining relationships with physical and non-physical entities that are entangled with them. This continuation of relationship, to their view, is necessary for the continuation of Atik. Cree understandings of respectful hunting have been co-enacted in collaboration with Atik through generations upon generations of Cree hunters adapting to Atik as they in turn respond to hunting and communication practices by either giving themselves or continuing to give themselves to hunters or by withdrawing. In this way, Atik and Cree hunters work together to understand the elements of sustainable relationship and the practices and values that underlie it. Continued respectful hunting is necessary for the Cree as a part of their tending to this relationship, which includes also tending to and passing on the rules about both physical and non-physical elements of Atik entanglements, including knowledge about individual bodies' health and reciprocity with Atik bosses. Present-day Cree elders and leaders make the connection between Cree practices and values and Euro-Western concepts of conservation, while modern Cree communities maintain the importance of relationships with more than physical entities for the maintenance of Atik populations. They're also aware of the physical needs of the species. Cree communities across Canada express overwhelming concern with protecting Atik. Even where they no longer hunt for food, Atik have great socio-cultural importance and affect Cree ways of life. As Cree peoples are deeply embedded in the Atik entanglements themselves, the survival of Atik is personal. They have been strong activists and voices against impacts and disturbances from industry and advocate for greater responses to climate changes that include hotter and longer wildfires. Indeed, in his analysis of Canadian caribou recovery efforts presented at the 2021 North American Caribou Workshop, biologist Mark Hebbleway declared that caribou will only continue to survive in areas where there is at least one strong Indigenous advocate. Because Atik and caribou are different entities, both in theory and in practice, it's imperative that ethical intercultural working together includes space for both, and Cree perspectives should be given equal weight. While many Euro-Western caribou stakeholders have made significant efforts to create spaces for Indigenous ecological knowledge, as well as for the knowledge holders themselves, such as the models seen here, there is still many places across Canada where more work in these areas could be done. In addition, Euro-Western researchers, wildlife managers, and policymakers still struggle with making spaces for aspects of Indigenous worldviews, especially those that touch on non-physical aspects, as Indigenous scholar Kim Tallbear has noted, or those that assume more than human personhood and agency. These are big gaps, and addressing them has far-reaching implications. A first step can be to, as one of my participants advised, simply spend time in Atik landscapes. This in itself, he noted, will strengthen the understanding of Cree worldviews as visitors engage with the entities present within them. A further step can be to expand intercultural research frameworks to make space for Cree ontological elements. Adjusting theoretical frameworks will also entail altering the epistemologies that are employed. In my own work, making space for communicative more than physical entanglements in caribou research necessitates changes to methods that consider their voices, senses, and more than human societies, such as those that apply zoosemiotics, Umwelt, or Doma's theories. It also sometimes entails relinquishing the position of expert or even of knower. As a beginning intercultural scholar who's learning what it means to be a part of Atik entanglements, learning another worldview has been both humbling and rewarding. I'll close with a paragraph that I wrote after participating in a canoe trip with members of a Lac La Range community. I learned what respect for plants, animals, and ancestors looks like in practice, offering tobacco and prayers for anything taken and taking only what we needed to survive. Respect for each other meant that this group of youth and adults moved through the journey across and with land and water together, helping each other through the hard parts. Together was a word that stuck with me after I was back home with clean, dry clothes. It's an important word, a multidisciplinary word, a more than human word, and not just for canoe trips. It is one that is essential for caribou conservation success. Thank you.